Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College. Normally, detectives are very flamboyant and very rational. He's kind of the anti-Sherlock Holmes. He doesn't pull out a magnifying glass. He doesn't study poisons and spiders. He just notices things.
Yeah.
But he's also has great moral intuitions. Often the solution is the kind of person that is in the room. I was just reading one last night, which was set in Chicago. But he says, well, if you had killed him, how would you do it? And the person goes, well, I think I would have gone by the window and shot an arrow through. And they go, well, that doesn't mean I did it, though. I'm just saying. And he said the very fact that they started coming up with a scenario for how they would have murdered a person shows that they're innocent.
Welcome to the Wade podcast. This morning, our conversation is titled Murder at the Wade. And I am joined by my co-director, David Downing, and our producer, Aaron Hill, to talk about murder.
Ooh.
It was a sultry day in August, and three people were in the basement of their home talking about a murder. One was the Reverend Aaron Acclivity, a junior scholar whose motives were not entirely clear. Is that what we're talking about, Murder at the Wade?
Well, tell them about the fiction we were thinking of writing.
Well, the Wade Center is a beautiful building right across the street from Wheaton's campus. But besides the museum space and the reading room and the office space upstairs, there is fragile storage downstairs where we keep all of the priceless artifacts, first editions, and handwritten letters.
Byzantine crosses and
Byzantine crosses, exactly. The Holy Grail is down there somewhere.
Also, books from C.S. Lewis's library that he has written in, which is an amazing resource for scholars.
But it's so valuable that you do not have a sprinkler system downstairs. If something ever happened, if there was a fire, the water would do worse damage to the manuscripts than much of the fire might do. So they have a system where they suck all the oxygen out of the room and replace it with an inert gas. But our idea for a mystery story is that some researcher who is not popular with everyone in the building would be in there and suddenly the door would lock and all the oxygen would be sucked out of the room.
Yeah.
So that's our idea for Murder at the Wade. But our actual topic this morning is two famous murder mystery writers, Dorothy Sayers and G.K. Chesterton. And they both were quite popular for their detective fiction apart from their Christian works. So we're going to talk a little bit about the two of them as detective writers and how their total personalities were manifest in their detective fiction.
In fact, Dorothy Sayers may not have become a detective fiction writer if it weren't for G.K. Chesterton, even though I've never run across a statement of hers where she writes about the Father Brown mystery stories. But she loved his novel, Napoleon of Notting Hill.
Oh.
She benefited greatly from his Christian apologetic treatise called Orthodoxy. And when G.K. Chesterton died, Dorothy Sayers wrote Chesterton's widow to say that your husband has affected my thought processes more than any other person. And she wrote someone else to say that if it weren't for G.K. Chesterton, she probably wouldn't be a Christian.
Oh, wow.
So that is pretty significant.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of their detective fiction, and we'll eventually get into this and how it ties into their faith, is a real fertile topic. But David, why don't you talk about Chesterton since he preceded Sayers by about 20 years?
Yes, he's one of the first generation of our 7 authors we collect at the Wade. George MacDonald, who had the great influence on C.S. Lewis, which we've talked about, also influenced Chesterton.
Yes.
Chesterton said his writings changed the way I think. I never realized that an ordinary house could have this angelic queen in the attic and have goblins in the basement. So MacDonald was an influence on several of our other authors, but also Chesterton. He was born in 1876, so he's solidly in the Victorian era, and died in 1874, he was born, and then died in 1936. So he was raised in a middle-class home in Kensington, a borough of London, went to a prestigious day school called St. Paul's. He was not at all a promising student. He was famously absent-minded. One time, the other students at recess put snowballs in the pockets of his jacket. And when he went back in the classroom, there were these puddles of water collecting around his chair. And the teacher asked him what was going on, and he said, there must be a broken pipe. And so she said, well, go tell the principal, go tell the headmaster that there's a broken pipe in the classroom. So he went up there and told the headmaster and came back down, and he never realized where the water was coming from. He was...
What?
Yeah, he was just kind of a...
Not a very astute detective in his
Not
real life.
That's what's ironic. He was not at all astute.
It does tell you a lot about his detective fiction where it's not about logic.
That is very true.
He said, I'm not absent-minded. I'm so present in mind that I am absent of the external details around me. And he proved that many times. After he started GK Weekly, which was his own private opinion paper, and he was the chairman of the board, he was late to a meeting and everybody else was waiting for him. And they said, what happened to you? Because he was coming a fairly short distance across London. And he said, I couldn't remember the address of the editorial offices. And I had to have the cabbie stop at several newsstands till we found one that had GK Weekly so I could look up the address and the masthead. So he was famously absent-minded. He's the last person you would expect to write detective fiction.
Wow. I wonder if he got in the cab and just said, GK's Weekly. And they're like, where's that? And he's like, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. So he went to art school and was very clever with caricatures and sketches and that sort of
His
thing.
artwork is really amazing, actually.
And there's often connection with someone who does caricatures and sketches. When you read their fiction, there's a lot of caricatures and sketches in the fiction.
Oh, yeah, I guess so.
That same ability to draw a very rapid impression. We were talking before the podcast about how quickly he can delineate character.
Yeah.
And you see that in the sketches he makes of himself and other characters.
Yeah.
So he actually had a Unitarian background, but he said he always had this tremendous feeling of gratitude, that the universe just seems so kind and generous and beautiful and awesome and wonderful.
Yeah.
And he kept searching for the meaning, and he kept saying, well, if it had meaning, someone must have given it meaning. So he had a brother, Cecil, who was as bright as he was, but not as joyful or cheerful or jocular. And they used to have these mammoth arguments. And sometimes after he got married to Frances Blogg, she heard this big argument going on next room. She went over and said, what's going on? Why don't you tell Gilbert to go take a walk? Oh, he's not here. I'm just practicing for next time we have an argument. They loved to argue, but they never let it become a quarrel. They just loved the thrust and parry of debate.
That's kind of like the relationship between C.S. Lewis and Owen Barfield.
It's very similar. Yeah, they really enjoyed that. So Frances Blogg was Anglo-Catholic, and when he met her, he suddenly felt like, oh, well, this is a big clue. If the universe does have meaning and does have this benign creator, maybe I should look into the person who created that meaning. So he really evolved toward faith. He didn't have a Damascus Road experience. And then eventually, in 1922, he became a Roman Catholic, even though his wife Frances did not.
That is interesting to me because in the bit of reading I've done, a lot of people assume that he was a Catholic earlier because he invented the Father Brown mystery stories. And Father Brown is a Catholic priest.
Yeah.
One critic said it took 11 years for Father Brown to convert his creator. Because the first Father Brown stories were 1911, and he was received into the Catholic Church in 1922. I think the reason his brother Cecil became a Catholic, his brother was killed in World War I, which was a great loss.
Oh, wow.
But other friends of his, like Hilaire Belloc, was Catholic. But Father Brown is based most directly on a good friend of Chesterton's named Father John O'Connor. And one time they were talking, they were on the way to Cambridge to visit some students. And Father O'Connor said, you know, the amazing things you hear in confession, you really get a view of human depravity and the human heart and twisted motivations.
Oh, wow.
And then they got to this group of undergraduates at Cambridge and they were saying, oh, you priest, what do you know about the human heart? We're the ones, we're young. And Chesterton was just struck by these two young men. He said, they didn't know anything more about the human heart than two babies in a nursery.
That's so insightful. And I think it's relevant to today where people think just because they've experimented with drugs and sex and alcohol, they know the ways of the world.
Mm.
Whereas a priest who hears confession probably understands human nature, human psychology, the ways of the world more than any other person.
Right. Well, I've experienced that. Sometimes my undergrad students will say, oh, you baby boomers, you don't know. Right now, there's just so much anger and rebellion and anti-authority. And I go, have you ever heard of Woodstock? Have you ever heard of the civil rights movement?
There's something about rebellion that gives you the sense that you've figured out the key to everything, and that it actually turns out trying to be good and be righteous, it actually teaches you a lot more about the human heart than just being rebellious.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
The light goes into the darkness, and the darkness comprehends it not.
Yeah.
Well, I think Chesterton said that. He said, good understands evil much better than evil understands good.
Mm-hmm.
So he wrote the first set of Father Brown stories in 1911, as I said. This is one of those insights you need for this podcast. He wrote over 50 stories in 5 books, all called The Innocence of Father Brown, The Something of Father Brown.
The incredulity of Father Brown.
And all the stories start with the. So if you're ever... all 5 books are the something, and all the stories are the Golden Cross.
Oh man,
the arrow.
What are we to make of that, David?
I'm still working on it. There's another dissertation right there.
Okay, THE. That is how the word theology starts.
Oh,
and
it's a good
it's
theory.
a definite article, and so
Yeah, definite article.
yeah, I have no idea where I'm going with that.
Well, this is why sometimes beginning writers let the computer do alphabetizing for them, and then you get 47 thes in a row. If you're going to alphabetize his stories, they would all be the. Most of the famous stories for Chesterton are in the first volume, The Innocence of Father Brown. I think he put a little bit more effort into this first series. He was a journalist, made a living writing. People would say the stories are uneven. Sometimes he whipped them out.
I was going to say his essays and his articles and everything are sort of uneven, even within the essay itself.
Right.
You feel like there's times where he's just sort of rattling off popular opinions that he had in a discussion with somebody earlier in the day, and then all of a sudden there's this very insightful bit, and then it's back to something else, and so that would just be, there's a macro level and then a micro level of that in Chesterton, I would say.
So books called The Quotable G.K. Chesterton are great because they extract those bits.
Little jewels.
Jewels of insight. C.S. Lewis had this funny comment about G.K. Chesterton's work on Robert Browning. And afterwards, and David, you may have to correct me on this, he said something like, after reading Chesterton's book on Browning, I wonder whether he ever read a single Browning poem.
Yeah. It's very interesting, but I can't tell he actually read any Browning. Apparently, there's 2 facts in that biography, or 2 dates, and they're both wrong.
Oh, wow.
He just didn't care about getting his facts straight.
Well, he had a capacious memory, but he wrote from memory without double checking. And even when people pointed out the errors, he said, well, I was just giving impressions. I wasn't trying to give a scholarly biography.
Yeah.
And all of his books should be called G.K. Chesterton on St. Francis, G.K. Chesterton on Robert Browning.
Yeah, he had the ability to sort of size up a situation, and size up a person. It's that sort of portrait sketch kind of ability that he has, which, gets you, 80% of the way, but it's that other 20%, it's the details and the data that he doesn't always get to, so.
Yeah. Well, even the scholars, though, I looked at some Browning scholars and Dickens scholars. They said, well, he had a lot of errors, but he also had a lot of insights that nobody's ever said before.
Yeah.
He says of Dickens, he loved Dickens, and he himself creates a lot of Dickensian characters in the Father Brown stories. He said he didn't write what the people wanted. He wanted what the people wanted. And it's a great insight about Dickens. He was very concerned about his social status and making money and all. And in many ways, it was easier for him to write those Victorian characters because that was the world that he himself was immersed in.
Huh. Yeah. I do like, though, how he likes to take pot shots at journalists in his Father Brown stories. I was reading the Curse of the Golden Cross before I came here to talk with you guys, and he makes this joke about a journalist in there. And I just thought, well, it's kind of funny because I wonder how he saw himself. Did he see himself as a journalist, or did he distinguish himself between, that? Because he seems to think that journalists don't have an honest bone in their body.
He does do that. He did. People called him a literary critic or a philosopher, and he said, "No, I'm a journalist." He owned that phrase, a journalist. He identified a lot with Samuel Johnson, who he liked a lot. He also had great girth. Someone said two of Chesterton's memorable traits were his girth and his mirth. But Johnson once said, anybody who would write for any other reason than money is a blockhead. And I think that Chesterton would probably agree with that. He was such a rapid writer. He was very prolific. Sometimes he'd be sitting at a pub talking with somebody about some topic, and they'd say something that would strike him as really interesting. And he would actually put a piece of paper up against the wall and start writing an article.
Really?
And so, yeah, he was amazing where, once again, his absent-mindedness, he would be sitting there outside reading a book and get so absorbed in the book, it would start raining and he wouldn't notice, and he'd come in and be soaked to the skin. But back to your question about a journalist, though, he did see someone, journal means of the day, and he thought he should comment as a Christian on everything that was going on in his time.
Yeah. Part
of it seems more dated now because so much of the politics and the issues that were going on between 1900 and 1930 is, he talks about the great Marconi affair.
Yeah.
There's a big scandal of people making money off the wireless. And
he talks about the fascisti or the fascist in one of his stories. And it's kind of, what's interesting to me is a lot of the things that he comments on, history has sort of come to a firm conclusion on.
Right.
And so his sort of opinion of the moment seems very dated looking backwards.
Although he was ahead of his time in terms of denouncing eugenics, because all the intellectual elite, especially left-leaning intellectuals, that this was the liberal way to go, that you would sterilize people who had disabilities because we have the scientific improvements. We need to make scientific improvements to better humanity.
Yeah.
And so way before Hitler started exercising eugenics, and people became horrified with eugenics, Chesterton had criticized it.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Chesterton made that point that people often didn't realize that philosophy, especially moral philosophy, had very practical implications. Eugenics means good birth. And the idea is let's help evolution along by getting rid of people who are not going to have fruitful offspring or offspring that will contribute to humanity.
Yeah.
He had the parable of these people say, what is this big lamppost doing in the middle of the sidewalk? It's blocking traffic. Let's knock it down. And the man comes along and says, well, let's talk about the value of light. And they go, we don't want to talk philosophy. We're practical people. We're can-do people. So they knock down the lamppost, and then night comes and they go, oh, maybe we should have talked about light.
Yeah.
And I think eugenics is that way in some kind of abstract form. You say, well, it would be good to improve the gene pool of humanity. But when you have Nazis going into mental hospitals and killing all the patients, suddenly that has a very different look to it.
Yeah.
You know who coined the term eugenics?
Dorothy Sayers?
No! David. Francis Galton, who was Charles Darwin's cousin. And the funny thing about it is he went around England to assess what are the people that we need to perpetuate their genes versus those that we should not be encouraging to reproduce.
Yeah.
And so he had in his pocket this little form where he would punch holes with a pen to count how many attractive people were in a certain village. But the naive thing about it is, of course, attractiveness is culturally constructed.
Yeah.
But he's just thinking he is doing a scientific method of recording. Okay, this village we need to encourage to reproduce because there's so many attractive people here.
Oh my
gosh. These are like Yelp reviews, but of people.
Yeah.
Huh?
Oh, wow.
That is cool.
You know, it's crazy. All of that sounds really dated. We need to move on past eugenics.
Yeah.
But if you look back during that time, they were actually also obsessed with like breeding different types of roses and breeding special types of dogs. There's very much this focus on selection and that you could make a better dog or you could make a better rose. And so you can see how they would think that would apply just across the board, you know, in general.
Right.
Rather than natural selection, we are helping it along.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to Chesterton.
Well, Chesterton loved the toy theaters. Chesterton says one of the most vivid memories of childhood was a debonair man in a mustache who's crossing a bridge, and he's looking up at a beautiful woman in the window, and he eventually reveals that it's from a toy theater. His father came from a very close family, and his father would make toy theaters with very vivid characters, and it has something to do with you actually understand life better or reality or nature when you see it through the framework of art, when something has limits to it. But Chesterton wrote an essay on how to be good at toy theater because he himself made toy theaters. He and his wife did not have children, but they loved to entertain children. And he said, you should have big, colorful characters that as soon as they walk on stage, you can tell what kind of person they are. And I think a lot of his principles for toy theater he applied to the Father Brown stories.
I agree. I actually pulled some character descriptions because I read one of them for you,
sure.
Or two of them actually. So these are from The Curse of the Golden Cross. In talking about one of the main characters, he says, he had a long, fair hair brushed back from a big, square forehead, long, straight features, and a curious mix of preoccupation with a poise of potential swiftness, like a lion pondering absent-mindedly on his next leap.
Yeah,
I mean, just the alliteration and the way it reads. And then later on, he's talking about this guy who's later revealed to be a detective. His name's Paul Tarrant. He's this American anti-type. He doesn't work. And he says he seemed to have nothing whatever to do but to change his clothes, which he did about 6 times a day. And I just thought that was very interesting, describing he really doesn't have anything much to do except change his clothes.
In fact, that focuses on one of the prejudices that you see repeated a lot in Father Brown's stories. He doesn't like Americans. Of course, C.S. Lewis didn't have positive things to say about Americans either.
Well, Lewis outgrew it as he got to know Americans and had more and more American fans. And when they sent him gifts after World War I, after World War II, when England was really strapped financially. So I think he outgrew it, but in early life, yes, he definitely had
He does. One more example. So this is from The Resurrection of Father Brown, and this is talking about an American Christian, which I thought was particularly relevant. He says, he had been taught a very Puritan or a purely evangelical sort of Christianity from the family Bible at his mother's knee. And insofar as he had time to have any religion, that was still his religion. Amid all the dazzling lights of the latest and even wildest discoveries, when he was at the very edge and extreme of experiment, working miracles of light and sound like a god creating new stars and solar systems, he never for a moment doubted that the things, quote, back home were the best things in the world, his mother and the family Bible and the quiet and quaint morality of his village.
Right. Well, that's actually kinder than a lot of his remarks on Americans.
It is, yeah.
He says in one point, when he came to America a couple times, and he said, the Americans have hearts of gold, but gods of brass.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just Americans, actually. The more you read, Frenchmen are too rational and Italians are too passionate. And
the very next line, he says, he had as serious and noble a sense of the sacredness of his mother as if he had been a frivolous Frenchman. So he just can't pass up the opportunity to take a shot at a Frenchman.
Yeah, and the Scots are too cursed by Calvinism. If you read like The Honor of Israel Gow, a story like that. Even Protestants, he gets in some pretty good shots on Protestants.
Yeah.
Really, if you want to be a centered person at the still point of the turning world, you should be an English Catholic. That's pretty much where you want to land.
It turns out, he happened to be at just the right place and have just the right personality.
Well, this is a good point then to go back to that question that we digressed from. In terms of his invention of his protagonist character, a Roman Catholic priest, because he wasn't Catholic when he invented that character. So let's talk about why that as your protagonist.
Well, I think it goes back to John O'Connor. They were very good friends, and John O'Connor was the one who received him into the Catholic Church.
Oh.
Now, he was not very plain like Father Brown, but he did have these great moral intuitions, and he actually wrote a book called Father Brown on G.K. Chesterton, because he accepted the idea that the character came from him.
Oh, wow.
Oh.
But there were a couple things that Chesterton was trying to do. Normally, detectives are very flamboyant and very rational. He's kind of the anti-Sherlock Holmes. He doesn't pull out a magnifying glass. He doesn't study poisons and spiders, and he's not a great authority. He just notices things.
Yeah.
But he's also has great moral intuitions. Often the solution is the kind of person that is in the room. I was just reading one last night, which was set in Chicago, not at all convincingly. He'd never been to Chicago. The Mistake of the Machine or something of that sort. But he says, well, if you had killed him, how would you do it? And the person goes, well, I think I would have gone by the window and shot an arrow through. And they go, well, that doesn't mean I did it, though. I'm just saying. And he said the very fact that they started coming up with a scenario for how they would have murdered a person shows that they're innocent. Because he says a true villain would say, oh, I would never even think of murdering someone. How dare even bring up that topic? But he thought the fact that they would speculate about it and then suddenly realize that made them into a suspect proves that they were innocent. So his specialty was not the magnifying glass and reading all the encyclopedias on ways to kill someone. It was on moral intuitions. And somebody said that a millionaire in a Father Brown story almost always ends up getting murdered or being the murderer. He had a definite, I wouldn't say prejudice, but he thought that rich people in general were the curse of humanity. And so they almost always
especially American businessmen who are eager to make money.
Yeah, exactly.
But also British aristocrats. Ooh, so he will criticize
Oh, that's right. Also
his
British
own
aristocrats.
people. He has a line in his short story, The Hammer of God, where he says, aristocrats live not in traditions, but in fashions.
Right. In many ways, that's the charm of the story. Often the actual detection is not all that satisfying at the end. They're kind of preposterous. He says, well, I happen to know that in his will, and you go, you happen to know that in his will? That's no fair.
Almost every one of his stories, he solves it at the end by, it's almost this like deus ex machina explanation where you could not have figured it out along the way. There's no clues that he lays. There's no sort of logic. There's always some sort of special knowledge or special insight that Father Brown sort of conjures up at the last minute. Oh, well, I happen to know that he put this poison in my drink, and that's why it looked like I was dead, and therefore, and he was doing all this to try and discredit, the Catholic Church, and I'm talking about the resurrection of Father Brown. And you just sort of go, well, how would I have known that along the way?
Right.
But he carries you along by the means of his prose and his description, so that you're kind of like, well, I'm enjoying reading this. I have no idea where it's going to go. And at the very last minute, there's this sort of like hard left turn, and you're like, okay, well, I don't know how I could have figured that out, but it was fun.
Right.
It is kind of surprising because one of the principles of the Detection Club, for which G.K. Chesterton was the very first president.
Really?
The club was put together in 1930 by a series of popular detective fiction authors. In fact, the period between the wars is often called the golden age of detective fiction. And in their initiation ceremony, where they would welcome new detective fiction writers into the club, they had to swear an oath, and part of the oath reflects what is known as the fair play rule, where you have to expose all the clues to the reader so that when the denouement occurs, the reader can say, oh, I didn't think of how that could fit in.
Yeah.
You don't have to tell about the detective's mental process to the end. And Chesterton, he never follows the fair play rule.
No, never. Never. It's an arrow through the window that shot the one guy, and turns out this other guy was the bad guy the whole time. You're like, how am I supposed to know that, Chesterton?
Right.
But part of the point, so I tried to figure this out, and part of the point of the Detection Club was just to enjoy the conviviality of intelligent persons who were writers. And I think everybody who met Chesterton just loved him because he was this delightful human being. And even though he had these prejudices against Americans and Protestants and Jews, he's been accused of anti-Semitism. But in person, he was gracious and open and loving to every person he met, even people that he had major disagreements with.
Including Jews, the old cliche, some of my best friends are Jews. He was interesting because he was a controversialist in his writings, but in person, everybody loved him.
Yes.
And everybody
even George Bernard Shaw.
Yeah, H.G.
Even
Wells.
Anti-Christians,
Yeah.
So what is interesting about the Detection Club, and this could segue us into Sayers, although we can go back and forth because they knew each other, because she was one of the founding members of the Detection Club. as was
Agatha Christie? Are we
As
guessing
was-
now?
yeah. Sorry, I have to find
Sir
my notes.
Conan Doyle.
No,
Oh.
he was dead by then.
I know.
Chesterton actually had a character who's kind of a satire of Sherlock Holmes.
Really?
He's trying so hard to solve the crime with empirical evidence. And of course, he gets everything wrong. And he's very officious and very arrogant about being a detective.
Oh, wow.
Whereas Father Brown, in some ways, he, this one reviewer called him, he says, I'm really coming to like that officious little loafer. He never seems to be working on his priestly duties, but he's always around, hanging around these people.
Yes.
And figuring out the crimes.
He never does seem to stop anything before it happens as well. You know, it's like somebody gets murdered or this happens and he's like, I was thinking that guy was a bad guy the whole time. And you're like, well, then why didn't you do anything?
So, in addition to Chesterton and Sayers and Agatha Christie, another founding member of the Detection Club was A.A. Milne, who wrote the Winnie the Pooh stories.
Really?
Turns out he was a detective fiction author before he became famous for Winnie the Pooh. And part of the reason he wrote Winnie the Pooh is for his son Christopher, hence Christopher Robin. And it reminds me of Tolkien, because Tolkien wrote The Hobbit for his children,
right.
including
Told the stories. Right.
including Christopher.
How come we didn't get a Winnie the Pooh, a detective fiction?
That's
I would have.
true.
Mm.
Wouldn't that be? Well, you know what? I take that back. I think there are some Winnie the Pooh stories where they're trying to solve a mystery or somebody disappears.
Oh, yeah, there aren't like
right?
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Who killed Eeyore? That wouldn't be for children.
Well, as I was doing research, I discovered another founding member was a man named Henry Wade.
Oh.
So,
Back to Murder at the Wade.
Uh-oh.
yes,
Oh.
I would love to do research to see if he could be an ancestor of the Wades who helped fund the Wade Center. So Chesterton was president first from 1930 until he died. And the next president was E.C. Bentley, who wrote Trent's Last Case.
Mhm.
And he was a good friend of
Chesterton's.
Chesterton's.
Right?
Yes.
He invented a poetic form called the Clary Hue,
Yeah.
which is a little humorous verse.
Right. And Sayers regarded Bentley's Trent's Last Case to be one of the most brilliant detective novels written. Then Sayers was president from 1949 to 57. And when she died, Agatha Christie took over.
Oh, wow.
But Agatha Christie was incredibly shy. She didn't like being in crowds. So she asked someone else to do all the presidential activities. She was just a figurehead because, of course, she is the most famous of all the Golden Age fiction authors, which is quite intriguing because Sayers in 1927 was asked to put together a book that was a compilation that was called Great Short Stories of Detection, Mystery, and Horror, where she's trying to give an overview of the whole genre.
Mm-hmm.
And what I really love about this book is how inclusive she is. She actually goes back to stories in the Hebrew Apocrypha as being some of the first mysteries that have to be solved.
Susanna and the Elders?
Yes, Susanna and the Elders and Bell and the
Bell
Dragon.
and the Dragon, yeah.
Right.
Huh.
And she has an introduction that is considered brilliant in terms of analyzing the genre. And she tries to include as many women writers as possible. And she even gives credit for tracking footprints to American Indians that were celebrated by Fenimore Cooper in America.
Oh, Last Mohegans, that sort of thing.
Yes. Yeah. But here's another fascinating thing. She's pulling together all these many stories that illustrate different kinds of detective fiction, but she does not include one single Agatha Christie story.
Ooh.
Even though by the time she was asked, Agatha Christie had published 7 novels and a whole collection of short stories. But a lot of the members of the Detection Club were bothered by one of her best-selling novels called The Murder of Roger Ackroyd because it doesn't use the fair play rule.
Oh.
And it has an ending that no one would be able to figure out. Now, some people like that. They go, oh, I can't believe that.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's why she doesn't include Christie. She criticizes Christie in her introduction for not following the fair play rule.
Huh. But not Chesterton.
But not Chesterton, I know.
Well, he wrote short stories, and he often had something else in mind than just a whodunit. He often was like, how done it? How did they do it? Or what was the meaning of this act? It wasn't just revealing the murderer.
He does that in the Curse of the Golden Cross at the end of it. The sort of protagonist figures, not Father Brown, sort of has this own personal realization. And so you see that sometimes in the story where it's like he's trying to make some sort of larger moral point, and it just kind of serves as a vehicle for that, I think.
Well, sometimes he actually lets them get away as long as they repent.
Yeah.
Flambeau, who was the villain in the first story he wrote, repented and became his Watson. He became his assistant. So, yeah, he often says something about he has them repent and then slip off into the night.
Yeah.
He actually considered Man Who Was Thursday to be a kind of detective novel. The Father Browns are all short stories.
Yeah.
But he said in the detective novel, some innocent-looking person who's very genial and respectable becomes unmasked, and they're actually some sinister murderer. He said in Man Who Was Thursday, all these anarchists who are very cynical group, turns out they're all detectives.
Yeah.
So he said he was trying to turn the usual cliche on its head.
I've always thought that would make a really good movie if you adapted that into a movie, because that's one of my favorite books by him. Because he just really just takes you for this ride, but you never feel like when you're reading it like it's supposed to make sense to you. It just feels more like almost like a thriller or like a Jason Bourne kind of a scenario.
Right. Well,
where,
he calls it a nightmare, so it's very dreamlike.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Especially the ending where the leader Sunday, they who are you? What are you trying to accomplish?
Yeah.
And he says, well, can you drink from the cup that I drink from? And he himself explained that Sunday sort of represents nature. It's beautiful and awesome and powerful, but it's also frightening and inexplicable. And when he says, can you drink from the cup that I drink from? It's almost like somehow God is behind nature, even though it's so inexplicable.
Yeah.
So it gets very metaphysical at the end of that story.
Yeah. It's definitely not a Father Brown story.
It's definitely not a Father Brown story. Right?
But Chesterton does love to turn things upside down. And he literally has characters go upside down. Like a character will hang from his knees from a tree. Another character will do handstands just for no reason at all. I mean, literally turning himself upside down as a type of metonymy for just what Chesterton thinks needs to happen in culture.
Yeah.
That the increasingly secularized British culture has lost sight for transcendent truth, and we need to turn that upside down.
Yeah, and there's definitely always some element of the natural and the supernatural, and whether was this a miracle? How do you explain this? There's often a big, that plays a big role in the story somehow. Crystal, I have a question for you as a Sayers scholar and a reader of Sayers detective fiction. We've talked about Chesterton's strengths and weaknesses as a detective writer, his gift for portraiture and his maybe not following the fair play rule. What are Sayers' strengths and weaknesses? What makes her a good detective fiction writer? What maybe do you think she doesn't do well? How is that different than Chesterton? I'm interested in your take on that.
Well, Sayers started out writing her first detective novel primarily for the money. That goes back to Sam Johnson's statement. She had tried her hand at screenplays. She had tried teaching. She hated teaching. And she just came up with this idea and had read enough detective fiction. So she invented this character named Lord Peter Wimsey. And in her first novel, which is called Whose Body, And her first several novels, he's much more like a P.G. Wodehouse character, the famous Jeeves, the butler, with Bertie Wooster, who's this aristocrat who's kind of can't keep track of things.
Gotcha.
So, in fact, the opening of Sayers' very first novel that introduces Lord Peter Wimsey, here's how she describes him. His long, amiable face looked as if it had generated spontaneously from his top hat as white maggots breed from Gorgonzola. Obviously not someone that we're supposed to respect like a Sherlock Holmes. And she had trouble selling it. It first got published in America, finally came out in 1923, and then was picked up in England and did pretty well. So she wrote several more and then some Lord Peter Wimsey short stories. But after her fourth novel, she actually told someone that she was getting sick and tired of Lord Peter Wimsey's everlasting breeziness, is what she called it. His just not taking things seriously except trying to solve these murders. And the first one, whose body, his mother just happens to call him up and say, Peter, the architect who's working on our church has found a dead body in his bathtub. Can you do something about it? I'm not quoting exactly, but
yeah.
And so it just, he's called in to try to figure it out, and he just happens to be a very good observer, and he picks up on details other people haven't. So after 4 novels, Sayers actually says, and she wrote an essay about this process, that she was getting so sick and tired of Lord Peter Wimsey that she decided she was just going to marry him off in order to get rid of him. So she invents a character named Harriet Vane, and she has Lord Peter Wimsey fall in love with her from afar. She's being tried for the murder of her live-in lover, who she is accused of poisoning with arsenic. And Peter has decided he is going to prove that she didn't do it. And as Sayers describes it, is she wanted to create a woman who happens, by the way, to be a detective fiction author. So a woman who makes her own living the way Sayers did. And she thought, okay, it has to be someone that would attract Lord Peter Wimsey's attention, not like other women in his life. And he's had lovers, but that didn't mean that much to him. And Harriet Vane isn't particularly beautiful, but she has this amazing voice and is really intelligent. And Sayers then
so
says,
he's interested in the mind of the maker.
Good one.
Sorry.
For those of you out there who don't get the allusion, Sayers wrote a famous book called The Mind of the Maker. But anyway, so once she invented Harriet Vane, this woman that she just wanted to have Peter marry so she could get rid of him. And in her introduction to the great short stories of detection, mystery, and horror, she admits that love stories don't work in detective fiction. It just, and you notice how in Sherlock Holmes that he has women that interest him, but there's never the love interest. It just seems gratuitous. It interferes with the process of actual detection, figuring out who committed a murder. So have Wimsey fall in love, she can get rid of him. But then she said Harriet Vane became such an interesting character for her that she didn't want to marry off this wonderful, brilliant woman to the dorky, there's that word again, the dorky Peter Wimsey. So she had to change Peter Wimsey to make him worthy of Harriet Vane. So she had to write several more novels to show the slow change and maturity of Lord Peter Wimsey to make him worthy of the final marriage between the two.
Is there a book that documents that? Wouldn't that be another good dissertation? Is the evolution of Peter Wimsey because of... Tim Keller has this interesting illustration in his sermon where he says that she knew there was something wrong with Peter Wimsey, so she wrote herself into the novel in the form of Harriet Vane, which I know you have problems with the idea that she's a stand-in for Dorothy Sayers. And by writing herself into the novel, she is able to improve the character of Peter Wimsey. And he gives that as a illustration of the incarnation. God actually had to enter into human history to get humans to understand what was meant to happen for their redemption.
I think she would like that metaphor, but I also think she put as much of herself into Peter Wimsey as she put into Harriet Vane. So they share various ones of her characteristics. It's very similar. There's a famous Russian theorist, a Christian theorist named Mikhail Bakhtin, who talks about dialogism, and he has written about Dostoevsky and how Dostoevsky put a little bit of himself
definitely
in all the characters he wrote, and especially the brothers Karamazov. And so like the three brothers are three aspects of himself. And I would say the same thing about Dorothy Sayers. Harriet Vane has characteristics of Sayers, but she's not a personification of Sayers.
And people said the same thing about the relationship between Father Brown and Flambeau. Father Brown is, Chesterton said, the main thing that makes him conspicuous is that he's so inconspicuous. And the reason, his main feature is that he's featureless. Whereas assistant Flambeau, the very name, the torch or the flame. Flamboyant.
Yeah.
Whereas Tolkien himself, he was a terrible dresser, part of his absent-mindedness. So if wife started giving...
Tolkien was?
No, I said Tolkien, sorry.
You said Tolkien.
Chesterton was renowned as being a terrible dresser. And so his wife started giving him... He was also got quite girthy. He weighed about 280 pounds toward the end of his life. So she gave him a big cape, and he had a sword stick that you could actually pull out and became a sword. And he loved the conventions of detective novel. He actually, on the day he got married, he bought a pistol to protect his new bride. So a part of him was kind of this Father Brown, very morally grounded, trying to use his moral intuitions to figure people out and what their problems were. But a part of him was very flamboyant. And so it's that same idea of the division of the self into different characters in your fiction.
Huh. That's interesting.
This is somewhat random, but he loved fate or coincidence, and that comes up quite a bit in the Father Brown stories.
Yeah.
When Gilbert and Frances had been married for a year, they said, let's just go out to the country. We need to get out of London. So he says, okay, let's do that. They walk outside. They see a bus that says Hanwell on it, and they thought that was funny because that's the name of a lunatic asylum in London. So they get on the bus to Hanwell. When they get near a train station, they get off and say, what is the first train leaving out of this station? And they said, train to where? Anywhere, just the first train leaving. So they get on the train. It takes them out to Slough, which is a suburb west of London. And they say, well, this looks nice. Let's take a walk around. And they start walking around Slough, and they get to a little charming village called Beaconsfield. It's spelled like Beaconsfield, but it's pronounced Beaconsfield. And they say, we'd like to live here someday. And end up moving to Beaconsfield for the rest of their life.
Wow.
But it all started with just this whimsy of the first bus we come to, the first train, let's walk in this direction. And somehow that love of coincidence or a feeling of kind of benign fate gets into his stories.
Definitely, very much.
In her introduction to the great short stories of detection, mystery, and horror, Sayers divides up different kinds of detective stories, and she divides her table of contents between writers who give us detection that is amateur detectives or private consultants. There is the journalist detective, the police detective, the scientific and medical detective, specialists in some area, like there's chess specialist, a card specialist, a railway specialist, the comic detective, but then finally she has what she calls the intuitive detective. And that's where she has G.K. Chesterton's story.
Yeah.
And she has the Hammer of God. And so she almost wants to accommodate him since he doesn't use the fair play rule, but she's not going to accommodate Agatha Christie.
Oh, wow.
Which is funny because Agatha Christie is the name that most people in the English-speaking world have heard of.
So my question to you guys as we wrap up is, why should people go back and read detective fiction from Sayers or Chesterton? What can you get out of it? People love novels. People love The Lord of the Rings and Chronicles of Narnia and these kind of fantasy worlds that you can immerse yourself in. And a lot of detective fiction is sort of episodic. You know, it's an event that happens in a place or in a town. Or Father Brown always seems to be traveling somewhere.
Right.
He's on a boat or he's going someplace. What is it about detective fiction, or what can people get out of detective fiction? And which one of the various stories would you recommend from either Father Brown or from Sayers as our listeners, or maybe they've never read any of the detective fiction? Then what can they get out of it, and what would you recommend?
Salvation? No, that's not the right answer. We can't go too far down this road because neither Tolkien nor Lewis liked detective fiction. Didn't read detective fiction. It's a kind of a jigsaw puzzle or a crossword puzzle. Can you take all the pieces and fit them together? And the kind of people who like detective fiction are often not the kind of people who like fantasy.
Okay.
And that's why when you talk to Chesterton fans, some people love Father Brown, but they don't get the other books. And other people like some of the fantasies, but they don't understand Father Brown. I would say for Chesterton, part of it is the setting. He does a wonderful job with settings. I said he loved toy theaters. And he always said, make sure you have rugged mountains in the background, or a deep, dense forest, or big thunderclouds. So he's great with setting. He's great with describing character and having insight into character. He says of one American millionaire, he was smart enough to make millions of dollars and foolish enough to think that was worth doing. And just that great little epigram is worth reading.
Yes.
One of them, he says, well, pride is the falsification of fact by the intrusion of the self. What a great definition of pride, that once you inject your ego and yourself into something, you're going to have a distorted picture. So it's worth it just for those great epigrams. Don't read it for the cleverness of the resolutions. He said, people don't like mysteries, they like revelations. And the reason that you have detective fiction is because things get detected. But often it seems to me like it was almost an afterthought. What's the solution to the crime?
Yeah.
So I would say beautiful prose style, setting and characterization, but don't expect to say, oh, I should have noticed that earlier clue where someone...
Yeah.
It's not that kind of fiction. In terms of titles, I would definitely say start with Innocence of Father Brown.
Yes.
There's one called The Queer Feet, where he solves the whole mystery simply by listening to people's footsteps as they go up and down the passageway. That's a very clever way to solve a crime.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. I will say this, reading Chesterton's Father Brown stories make me very observant about the world. I start to think about the world, and you start to be more, absent-minded about the details and more present in the moment. And so he has this line in one of his stories, which I loved. In the midst of all this tornado of beatitude was a little man struggling to be heard. He has those kinds of lines just kind of sprinkled throughout. Right. And as you're reading, they kind of cause you to stop and to think about it. And then when I work out, I write like a little thing like, how was your workout? And it makes me want to be like very observant and poetic about what I'm writing about for the day. And so I don't know, it feels like it kind of enhances me and my observational skills and things like that.
I feel the same way. When I encounter a dead body, I don't say, oh, here's how they were murdered and here's who must have murdered them. I realize you can't jump to conclusions. Just spend a little time thinking, were they a millionaire? Were they American? Ask yourself those kind of questions.
You're being facetious, but that is one of the points that Sayers makes in her introduction to great short stories of detection, mystery, and horror, is that basically the genre is escapist because it's something that will never happen to us.
Oh, okay.
And so it just takes us to another form of life. We know it happens out there, but most of us have never seen a murdered body.
Gotcha. So what do you think, Crystal?
I was just going to say, it's very improbable. They have these little villages where someone gets murdered every week, these charming little English villages.
Like, there's 200 people who live in the village,
There's no city in the world that's as dangerous to live in as these little English villages.
Yes.
But look at the number of detective shows that are streamed now.
Oh, yeah.
There is this fascination, and I think because we know it happens, that murder occurs, but it's so beyond our experience. We're fascinated by people who do have to deal with it. So what makes Sayers very interesting, and many scholars of detective fiction point this out, is she entirely changed the genre with her second to last detective novel. She only wrote 12, but her second to last is called Gaudy Night, and there is no murder in it.
That's right.
There is no body. But there is a mystery that has to be solved. But the mystery that has to be solved is subordinate to a larger human mystery that was paramount in the 1930s. The novel was published in 35, I'm pretty sure. It might have been 36. Harriet Vane is struggling with the mystery of how in the middle 1930s can a woman have a career and consider marriage, which in the 1930s was a mystery.
Yeah.
And she was left with what most people would say would be an either-or proposition. And she goes back to her alma mater at Oxford University, a college that Sayers called Shrewsbury, but was obviously inspired by the college at Oxford that Sayers herself, a women's college.
Somerville.
Yes. And she just admires the life of the female professors, none of whom are married, and just the life of the mind. And to be able to do her work.
Another thing about Gaudy Night is the beautiful prose.
Yes.
I was trying to evoke Oxford in my novel, Looking for the King, and I was looking at other novels set in Oxford. So I went back to Gaudy Night, and just the very first page, what beautiful description and what perceptive description.
Yeah.
So once again,
shows her brilliance.
There's a kind of detective novelist who kind of churns out detective fiction for the sake of the plot, like a jigsaw puzzle. But other ones like Chesterton and Sayers, you really enjoy the ride just because of the prose style and insights into human nature.
So this changed things up radically. But nevertheless, soon after she finished Gaudy Night, she got a request to write the play for Canterbury Cathedral that we've talked about in other podcasts. And she loved...
Was that Murder in the Cathedral?
No, that's T.S. Eliot.
Oh, sorry. Excuse me.
The Zeal of Thy House.
Yes, The Zeal of Thy House. And she loved the collaborative nature of drama, so that you have a writer, you have actors, you have directors, you have lighter. She felt that theater was the way the church should be like. We all have a project that we're working on. And she never went back to detective fiction. And by the time she wrote The Mind of the Maker, which is a Christian view of creativity, she actually says in Mind of the Maker that detective fiction is not great literature because it's not the way life works. Life is not a puzzle that as soon as you put together all the clues, you have a happy ending. And she wanted to write things that were more about truth. And this gets us to the final reference indicated by the title of today's podcast, Murder at the Wade. Because what is distinctive about Lewis, who was very influenced by both Sayers and Chesterton, as well as MacDonald and other Wade authors, is that they all believed in the murder of God. That if you assert and affirm the doctrine of Christianity, you believe that Jesus was fully God as well as fully human.
Mm-hmm.
So that when Jesus was crucified, it was God that was murdered on the cross.
Mm-hmm.
One of the keynotes of Chesterton's life was gratitude. Before he became a Christian with this vague Unitarian background, he just felt like life is so wonderful. It's such a gift. And when he became a Christian, it gave him someone to be grateful to, someone to acknowledge. And he had a great notebook that he kept as a young man, just as he was arriving at Christian faith. And one of these little poems in his notebook says, "You say grace before meals. All right. But I say grace before the play and the opera, grace before the concert and the pantomime. I say grace before I open a book, and grace before sketching, painting, swimming, fencing, boxing, walking, playing, dancing, and grace before I dip the pen in the ink." And it's just a wonderful early expression of his lifelong sense of gratitude for the gift of life.
Yeah.
Nice.
Thank you guys both for letting me join you in your basement. Hopefully no murders will occur in the basement before in the basement before the end of the podcast. And I think for me, the reason why I enjoy detective fiction is sometimes I long for justice in a world.
Oh, right.
Where often it feels like the bad guys get away with doing evil things and justice is not served. And so even though, unfortunately, you're right, that is often not what happens. This is not what happens in the real world. As Lewis says in Paralandra, things fall below justice in this world. It's good to read a detective story where the bad guy gets caught and he gets his due and the good guy figures it out and they're able to thwart further evil or, things end up happy in the end, even though it's not how things often work in the real world.
And hence the escapism of it. We desire, that is what we all desire.
Yeah.
And it might be one of those desires that feeds a sense that there's got to be a larger explanation to existence, that there is an ultimate justice, that there is a God who will redeem a sinful world.
Not only will justice be done, but it will be seen to be done.
Good comment.
Thanks, guys. The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.